Hello, I'm Tom Rothman of 20th Century Fox. Welcome to Fox Legacy. We're glad to have you with us. A runaway dog? Sad. A runaway train? Dangerous. A runaway movie production? Terrifying. And almost always career fatal for the individuals, if not the studio involved. Now, just about every major studio has had one or two in their history, and their names live in infamy in Hollywood lore. Columbia had Ishtar. Universal had Waterworld. United Artists had Heaven's Gate. Studio heads, like baseball managers, are often victims of debacles beyond their control. But studios themselves, even in the old days before they were owned by larger, well-financed conglomerates as they are now, are hardy entities because they have the collected value of libraries of content built over decades. But they are not invulnerable. And the greatest threat to any of them is the dreaded runaway production. A production whose costs and delays and problems outstrip any potential it might have once had to, at first, earn a profit, and then, by the end, not to lose so much as to put you out of business permanently. 20th Century Fox has had two notorious runaway productions in its 75-year history, and I was actually head of production on one of them, Titanic. That one, however, was the exception that proved the rule. It not only went on to make a huge profit, which seemed impossible during the struggle of making it, but became the highest grossing movie of all time, until recently surpassed by Jim Cameron's own next film, Avatar. It's always said, looking back, that the studios involved in runaway productions would have been better off shutting down and taking a big loss when the movie first went out of control. But that would have been a terrible mistake with Titanic. Not so, however, with Fox's other famous, infamous production, tonight's Titanic undertaking, Cleopatra. This movie is perhaps the one film in all of Hollywood history where the stories behind the camera most outstripped any of the story in front of the camera, notwithstanding the 96 hours of film that were actually shot. And while those of us who worked on Titanic not only survived but prospered, having been blessed with the results of Jim Cameron's genius, and also the learning that comes from wrestling with such a production, the architects of the Cleopatra production calamity were not so lucky. From high in the upper deck of hindsight and distance, the story is rich and riotous, and I'll tell you some of its highlights tonight, but I don't do it with glee or relish, as I know well how awful it must have been to have been hooked on a Nantucket sleigh ride to Cleopatra. And I think, with humility, there, but for the grace of God, goes anyone in my job. So let me begin with a little frame of reference for you. Titanic, the longest live-action shoot I've ever been involved with, shot for over 150 first unit days and cost about $200 million. Cleopatra shot for over 400 days. And its exact cost? Well, it's lost in a cardboard box somewhere, but it's reported between over $40 million. Now, in 1960 dollars, that's over $300 million today. If that's not the most expensive movie ever made in absolute terms, it's certainly by far the most expensive movie ever made in relative terms, meaning relative to the studio's other earnings and resources in 1960. Remember, then a movie ticket brought the studio only around 35 cents. And as for home video and television sales, oh, whoops, they didn't even exist. So how did Cleopatra happen? Well, there's no one answer. There are many answers, and all of them are bad. Producer Walter Wanger wanted to make a movie of the Cleopatra story, which had been told twice before, the 1917 Theda Barrett silent version and the 1934 Claudette Colbert version. The story has a lot of elements that obviously can make for a great picture: romance, intrigue, betrayal, exotic locales, epic battles. And Wanger had a solid reputation as a filmmaker. He made John Ford's Stagecoach in '39 and Hitchcock's Foreign Correspondent in '40. Wanger pitched Cleopatra to Elizabeth Taylor. Taylor, after Giant, Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, and Suddenly Last Summer, was by far and away the biggest female drama movie star on the planet. Wanger then pitched it to Spiros Skouras. He was president and the man in charge of 20th Century Fox. Skouras was a larger-than-life Greek immigrant who came up the ranks on the exhibitor side of our business and had partnered with Zanuck for many years. In Skouras' eyes, a project like this could be a nice B picture with a modest $1 million outlay and a solid, modest return. He gave Wanger a 10-page script from the Theda Barrett silent movie and said, "Just give me this over again and we'll make a lot of money. All it needs is a little rewriting." Wanger looked at that flimsy script and thought, no, it's going to need to be a lot more than that to attract Liz Taylor. Skouras thought that Taylor was, quote, unmanageable, which, by the way, she was. He thought any contract player could play Cleopatra, Joan Collins, for example. During development, Skouras saw that large-scale period epics like MGM's Ben-Hur, for example, were suddenly big box office, and Cleopatra, he saw, had that type of potential. Skouras' good friend, Ruben Mamoulian, the director of popular Tyrone Power films The Mark of Zorro and Blood and Sand, came on to direct. And casting the lead role turned into one of the biggest revolving doors in Hollywood history. Now, in an industry where there are precious few, then and now, great roles for women, word spread quickly. And every major actress from around the world wanted in. Sophia Loren, Gina Lollobrigida, Brigitte Bardot, everyone. Mamoulian, very bravely, wanted to cast Dorothy Dandridge, who perhaps had an historically accurate Ethiopian look for the role. But as Dandridge herself knew better even than he, that was sadly too daring a choice back then. So the field narrowed to Liz Taylor and, if you can believe it, Audrey Hepburn. But Hepburn was under contract at Paramount, so it went to Liz. But Liz demanded a $1 million payday, a jaw-dropping figure back then. Fox passed. Instead, Fox turned to one of its contract players, Susan Hayward. Well, when Taylor heard that, she wept and quickly lowered her fee to a mere $750,000, plus 10% of the gross. But here, Elizabeth, perhaps knowing the truth about herself that the producers were so afraid of, was much, much smarter than Fox. And here, the first of several terrible, short-sighted mistakes were made by the studio. Some foolish soul, thinking he was saving money, agreed to her $750,000, but covering only a 16-week schedule, rather than what we call, quote, run of the show. She was to get overages at $50,000 a week. Do the math on a movie that's shot for 90 weeks, with Liz getting $50,000 a week. And as to gross, on that, there was no protection for the studio if the film ran over budget, so they had to pay her 10% of every dollar they took in, no matter how much money they were losing. Elizabeth Taylor made over $7 million on Cleopatra so far. She was no one's fool. As to the rest of the casting, well, for Julius Caesar, Skouras wanted Cary Grant. I'm sorry, Spiros, I just can't see that. Liz wanted Rex Harrison, who the studio hated. For Cleopatra's second lover, Mark Anthony, Wanger lobbied hard for an unknown named Richard Burton, but he wasn't a movie star, so that withered. Ultimately, production was scheduled to commence with Peter Finch as Caesar and Stephen Boyd, best known for a key role in Ben-Hur, as Mark Antony. Wait a minute. Aren't Rex Harrison and Richard Burton in this movie? Stick around. Well, the next key decision was where to shoot the film. And because of favorable production incentives, which, by the way, still drive a lot of decisions today, they decided on England. Okay, to be fair, when you're shooting on a soundstage, you can be anywhere. And much of Cleopatra would be filmed inside Pinewood Studios. But the overcast England countryside was supposed to double as the streets of Rome and the deserts of Egypt. That's tough to do without spending a lot of money on it, which sadly they did, and let alone the English weather problems that were inevitable. When challenged on this decision, Scoras insisted, quote, "I don't believe in experts. The weather's going to be fine. No one will get sick. England is the best place to make this picture. Go ahead, shoot the film." Well, unfortunately for Mr. Scoras, the exact opposite of everything he said would come to pass. The first day of shooting went great, but by day 2, Elizabeth Taylor was too sick to make it to the set, and she would not shoot a frame of film for 1 year. "If Elizabeth coughs," one wag said at the time, "Fox gets pneumonia." And she did way more than cough. She, in fact, grew gravely ill. Taylor developed pneumonia with a rampant staph infection, and she fell comatose. A surgeon actually had to perform an emergency tracheotomy. He said she would have only survived another 15 minutes without it. Taylor said, "I was pronounced dead 4 times. News bulletins flashed around the world that Elizabeth Taylor was dying. Obituaries were prepared and headlines cleared. Taylor's condition bumped all other international news from the world headline for several days. More than 12,000 messages were received and stacked in laundry baskets. An American government agency even allowed drugs still in the testing stages to be flown to London. At one point, a wire service actually reported that she died, an announcement that perhaps threw more panic than grief into the offices of 20th Century Fox. Taylor, who always maintained a great sense of humor about herself, said, "I had the chance to read my own obituaries. They were the best reviews I'd ever gotten." Well, meanwhile, while she was sick, money was flying out the window. There was an insurance policy which allowed Fox to recoup some of the losses due to Taylor's absence, but in order to collect, production had to move forward. Didn't matter what, they just had to keep shooting. So every day, Peter Finch would walk out on his ship, pose for the camera, turn around, that's it, they'd wrap. They did that day after day, until on the 14th day, Finch couldn't make it to the set because he was having a nervous breakdown. Sad for him, but perhaps we have his experience on Cleopatra to thank as inspiration for his brilliant performance as a man having a nervous breakdown in network. Ultimately, the entire England shoot, complete with its $600,000 massive set, was scrapped. $5 million later, they had only 10 minutes of footage, and none of it would ever be used. Mankiewicz quit as director mere moments before he was about to be fired. Well, in the search for another director, Elizabeth Taylor contractually had approval, and there were only 2 names on her list, George Stevens and Joseph L. Mankiewicz. Stevens was unavailable, lucky sod. So Scoras focused all his attention on Mankiewicz, Academy Award winner for A Letter to 3 Wives and All About Eve. Mankiewicz, though, said famously, "Why would I want to make Cleopatra? I wouldn't even go see Cleopatra." And seeking advice from the former director, Mankiewicz told him, "Do as I did, resign." But an exceptionally large paycheck ultimately seduced him. And I've seen this many times in my career. And when talent takes a job because of money, it almost never ends well. Whether indeed he was right for the job, you'll judge tonight. For the film he made is, for all its spectacle, an intimate, emotional drama. Not at all what I expected when I first saw it. Mankiewicz was a director who believed in the power of words above all, and yet here is a movie defined by imagery. With his smart literary background and his own version of Julius Caesar that he filmed a few years earlier with Marlon Brando, Mankiewicz brought psychological subtext to his page 1 rewrite. He changed the virginal Cleopatra from the previous script into a powerful woman who knows how to use her sexuality to further her goals. Obviously, a very smart change given the smoldering sex appeal of his star, and also very prescient given what was to come. Mankiewicz wanted more time to work on the script, but he faced a fast-approaching start date. The picture by now had become infamous for its inefficiencies and delays. and Skouras needed a hard date to give to his board of directors. Skouras' position at the company was tenuous at best because of record losses, but like a true Hollywood dreamweaver, he went before the board and told them flat out, this would be the biggest film in the history of Hollywood, and they believed him. So, as they rushed back to shooting on September 25th, 1961, all of the same mistakes were made all over again. An unfinished script, an incomplete cast, and insufficient planning. They had no sets, no completed costumes, no props. Mankiewicz would wind up shooting all day and writing all night. It took a monumental toll on him personally. No wonder, he later said, it was the toughest 3 pictures I ever made. Finally, when production resumed, despite Skouras' objections, Liz Taylor got the leading man she'd been lobbying for. Not Richard Burton, mind you. She wanted and got Rex Harrison to play Caesar. But for Taylor, the decision to cast Richard Burton to play Mark Antony would be far more significant. It started off innocently enough. On the first day of shooting, Burton was hungover as usual, and Taylor helped steady his trembling hand as he tried to drink some coffee. Soon, whispers began to surface. Mankiewicz was one of the first to recognize what was going on, telling producer Wanger that he was sitting on a volcano. During love scenes, he would yell, "Cut," but his actors would just keep on kissing. Burton was a notorious playboy with a reputation for sleeping with all his co-stars. He initially thought it was just a fling. So, before things went public, Burton ended the affair. Elizabeth Taylor nosedived into such a funk that she couldn't make it to set. She allegedly overdosed on sleeping pills or suffered from food poisoning, depending on whether you want to believe the official story or not. And a few days later, the affair resumed. It became the biggest scandal of the decade. I cannot overstate for you just how big a deal it was. I tell you, they made Brad and Angie look small time. It's like sleeping with Khrushchev. He didn't use the word sleeping with, but you can figure it out. Burton explained, "How did I know the woman was so damn famous?" You see, both Burton and Taylor happened to be married to other people at the time. Liz already had caused one grand scandal when she home-wrecked America's sweetheart Debbie Reynolds by stealing Eddie Fisher from her. Fisher, a usually famous singer in his own right, was even a paid on-set consultant, or a highly paid babysitter perhaps, on Cleopatra. He took care of Liz, got her on set, he even posed her exactly right during her famous nude scene. And when the news of the affair broke, he got into some epic arguments with Burton. He wasn't alone, though. Burton's own brother beat him up for cheating on his wife, and he couldn't work the next day because of a black eye. Liz missed 22 days of shooting with her own black eye. Official story? Car accident. But Skouras told Zanuck later that Burton had hit her. Things were clearly getting out of hand. And to make things worse, Congress was getting involved. Congressman Iris Blitch tried to censure the two lovebirds, attempting to ban them from re-entering the United States on grounds of undesirability. Condemnation even came from the Vatican that accused Liz Taylor of, quote, erotic vagrancy. How odd is that? So there you go. When you get dissed by the Pope, then you're in Liz and Dick's league. The affair raged beyond control, and so did the shoot. The schedule was completely out of whack, causing massive overtime pay. For example, Carroll O'Connor, and I have to say it's odd to see Archie Bunker as a Roman senator, but anyway, he was scheduled to work for 15 weeks. He stayed 10 months and shot for only 17 days. Extras rioted, using guns and rocks and clubs. Dancing girls went on strike because their costumes were too skimpy. The Italian locals managed to put personal items into the film's budget to the point where $3 million was spent on so-called miscellaneous items. And the piece de resistance, an elephant caused trouble and was fired. What happened? The owner sued for slander, to which Skouras replied, "How the hell do you slander an elephant?" That's a fair question, I think. As fate would have it, we actually had live elephants here on the Fox lot today. for our film Water for Elephants with Reese Witherspoon and Rob Pattinson. And just let me be clear, I have nothing but good things to say about the elephants. So what kept Mankiewicz and his crew going through this truly troubled production? It was the belief that they were actually making a good movie. When they eventually got footage back to the Fox lot, everybody was very excited about what they were watching. I myself had a very similar experience on Titanic. Every morning I'd get up, I'd read the papers, I'd read Titanic Watch, plastered on the front page of Variety with headlines that said, Fox sinking, globe, globe, globe. The naysayers thought we were making our own version of Cleopatra at the time. I thought myself, never work again. But then, every afternoon, we'd go into the screening room Z, which for years I thought was actually named for Daryl Zanuck, but it's not. And lo and behold, the dailies looked great. They looked fabulous. I would beg the press, look guys, you'll have your chance. Maybe this is the biggest disaster ever made, but all I can tell you is we're looking at it every day, and it looks pretty damn good to us. So why don't you just wait until the movie comes out, and then you can write its obituary. I'd be lying if I said vindication is not a sweet dish. Skoros was hoping, praying, that he was in the same lucky boat. But after Fox lost over $22 million in 1961, his job was in serious jeopardy. I will say that was one of the things that really helped us during Titanic. We had kept going in the rest of our business and had a number of hits the year before Titanic came out and the year after Titanic came out, and they all helped keep the company in very strong financial shape. All that was very different than the situation Skoros faced. Fox executives were breathlessly awaiting the moment when Cleopatra's death scene was shot. Not because they were captivated by the on-screen drama. No, once that was shot, they could shut it down and, as we say, get out of Dodge. 96 hours of film had been shot. But the responsibility for cutting the movie together didn't fall into the hands of the people who'd made it. Producer Wang was fired. Skoros was finally fired too. He was the highest profile casualty in the cinematic undertaking. So Mankiewicz tried his hand at a 5-hour, 20-minute cut. But by then, Daryl Zanuck was back in charge, in his triumphal return, having been reinstated as studio chief. As the lights went up from the screening, Zanuck sat back and proclaimed, quote, "If any woman behaved towards me the way Cleopatra treated Antony, I would cut her balls off." Then Zanuck promptly fired Mankiewicz. He put out the following statement, quote, "In exchange for top compensation and a considerable expense account, Mr. Joseph Mankiewicz has for 2 years spent his time, talent, and $35 million, that was his figure, of 20th Century Fox shareholders' money to direct and complete the first cut of the film Cleopatra. He has earned a well-deserved rest." Those were the days. But Zanuck soon realized he desperately needed Mankiewicz. Only Mankiewicz had lived with the footage and had a handle on it. So he was rehired and actually given another $2 million to film reshoots on a new 39-page script so that the film could finally make some sense. On the Fox Movie Channel, you will see the opening night version. This is the closest to Mankiewicz's vision that exists today. It runs about 4 hours. That later was cut further to 3 3/4, and then after that to 3 1/4 hours for the wide release. Mankiewicz grumbled, "The reduced film was a complete distortion," he said, "a parody of what I wanted to do. I disown it." Zanuck hammered it into pieces with that polo mallet he used to carry. I love that image. So, the stakes were obviously high as the most expensive movie raced towards theaters. In the great film, The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, the immortal line is, "When the legend becomes the fact, print the legend." And that, I'm proud to say, is what we do in this town. But tonight, I guess I owe you the straight scoop. The legend is that Cleopatra was a massive failure that forced the studio to sell off its expansive backlot real estate to avoid bankruptcy. That legend is so ingrained that I myself believed it to be absolutely true and oft repeated it, until I read the research for tonight's show. You see, what actually happened was Cleopatra did very well. Not well enough at first to recoup or to save Skoros, as he was axed before it came to market. But it was far from a flop. Indeed, by the time the TV rights were sold in 1966 and the film eventually went into video in the early 1970s, it actually made profit. The film received mostly strong reviews and was nominated for Best Picture and won 4 other Oscars. At the time, it became one of the top 10 grossing movies ever. So what about the story that all the losses on Cleopatra caused Fox to sell off its backlot to avoid bankruptcy? Well, here's a little known fact. Skoros announced plans to sell off the backlot in January of 1958, 8 months before he was even pitched the idea for Cleopatra. And when the deal was completed in April of 1961, Fox was only in the hole for $5 million on Cleopatra. Relatively speaking, not a number that sends a studio into bankruptcy court. So what happened? Well, it wasn't Cleopatra that caused so much turmoil at the studio, at least initially. It was television. Throughout the 1950s, as box office attendance dropped and the little black and white sets became all the rage, all the studios took losses. But while the movies were temporarily a losing proposition, where could they turn? Maybe the ground under their feet. You see, by the late 1950s, Los Angeles was growing and the demand for land was massive. Thus, not just Fox, but Warner Brothers, Paramount, and Universal all sold off chunks of their backlots. Now the bulldozer roams over the land, Skoros said. Demolition is already underway. Already gone is the colonial mansion built in 1934 for Shirley Temple's The Little Colonel, and the different backgrounds for The Grapes of Wrath and 80 other motion pictures. It was, indeed, the end of an era. So although Cleopatra felled a regime, the real estate sale actually kept the studio going long enough for Zanuck and his son, friend of Fox legacy Richard Zanuck, to rebuild and get us back on solid financial footing from which, I'm happy to say, we have never faltered. What then finally is the true legacy of Cleopatra? Here on Legacy after all? Well, I suppose in this town of stories, it's that the story about the story was more entertaining than most movies themselves. And it's one of a kind. Thousands and thousands of films have been made before and since, but few, if any, achieve immortality because of what happened off the screen. Though here's a final point, sometimes overlooked, but what I urge you to watch for as you watch the movie. If the story within the film had not been such a keen mirror for so much of what was going on behind the film, I don't think its fame would have so endured. That is the dominant irony, of course. The film you're about to see is itself a tale of ambition and politics, of lust and betrayal, of the ultimate destruction of an empire born of overreaching, miscalculation, and love. Above all, love. The logo with the sweeping lights that you are about to see and the famous fanfare that you are about to hear survived Queen Cleopatra and, only slightly modernized, still grace movie screens in every corner of the world every single day of the year. Because, above all other things, a ship of state sails on. That is truth, not legend, but it's surely comforting all the same.
Let them make you king or whatever they choose, wherever they choose. Let me serve with you. My allegiance with yours. Together we'll conquer for Caesar a world beyond the wildest dreams of even Alexander.
Play conqueror all you want, mighty Caesar. Rape, murder, pillage. But neither you nor any other barbarian has the right to destroy one human thought.
For Fox Legacy, I'm Tom Rothman, and I'll see you next time. Good night.